Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming along to November's PEPSS seminar series. Let me just share our intro slides. Oh, the mouse is really janky.
Yeah.
Okay, so today's seminar topic is on what counts as legitimate democratic participation for young people in modern democracies. And before we get started, I do, of course, just want to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. And so just a few things to note. Obviously, we've got a fair few people joining us on Zoom, so hello to all the people on Zoom. And this presentation is being recorded for later use. So if you don't want to appear in that and you're online, just leave your video off and put your comments in the chat. And the recordings will be uploaded later on the PEPSS page of the Social Change Lab. And of course, if you want to be added to the mailing list for this series, you can apply to do that at the email address on the slides. Okay, so just to introduce our first speaker today, our first speaker is going to be Associate Professor Sarah Moulds, who's an Associate Professor in Law at the University of South Australia in the Justice and Society Department, and is the co-founder of the Rights Resource Network South Australia, which is a network of community organisations, legal professionals, academics, and volunteers committed to improving human rights outcomes in South Australia. She's passionate about parliaments and connecting citizens and communities with lawmakers, and her book, Committees of Influence, explores the important role of parliamentary committees play in rights protections in Australia. And just one final note before I hand over to Sarah is that if you aren't familiar with our format, normally what we'll do is we'll have two speakers who will each speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then once those presentations have both finished, we'll invite both speakers to comment on each other's presentations before we open up to a sort of interdisciplinary discussion and shared question time with the audience as well as the speakers. So thanks so much, Sarah. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'll just now get my slides organised. Are they looking okay, everyone, now in the room? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for having me. What a pleasure and privilege to be part of Social Change Lab's discussions once again. I'm so honoured to be here. I'm on Kaurna land here in South Australia at the City West campus of the University of South Australia, and I pay my respects to the Kaurna people, acknowledge their ongoing connections to the land and waterways in this area, and acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. I'm super excited to be on this panel alongside Ed, talking about what counts as legitimate democratic participation by young people in modern democracies. And part of what I'm going to be sharing with you is some insights that I was really fortunate enough to gather as part of a Churchill Fellowship I did a couple of years ago that took me to England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales to talk to people working in Parliament and young people in those places about how they participate in democracy in those countries and to share some of the great things that are happening in Australia. And I've also recently had the privilege of spending some time in working with groups in New Zealand, including young people in New Zealand who have also shed some light on this theme for me from their perspective. So I really want to honour all the people that have generously talked to me about this topic and given me the privilege of being able to share thoughts in a forum like this. I honestly feel like the luckiest girl in the world. The topic I'm talking about has some seriousness to it. It has some urgency to it because modern democracies like Australia are facing a kind of perfect storm at the moment of challenges that seek to unsettle and disrupt and even displace some of the democratic norms and institutions that past generations have taken for granted. And this declining trust in democratic institutions, by that I mean things like parliaments or governments, is having a really serious and profound impact on our short-term and medium-term and long-term approaches to economic and social policy and it's even featured in national security debates. So to give you an example, the Australian Home Affairs Department in 2024 said, democracies around the world are struggling with a range of shared problems. Australia is not immune. Global trends are tangling with more localised issues to challenge the foundations of Australia's democratic strengths. Trusted institutions, credible information and social inclusion. While none of these challenges are wholly new, in combination they pose complex and compounding threats to democracy. So there is a lot at stake if we think about the prospect that the next generation and the current generation of young people might not share that connection to our democratic processes and institutions that has previously been taken for granted. Now, I want to be really clear about something, and that is I am not suggesting that young people are not interested in democracy or not interested in politics or don't care about what's happening to our country and our democratic institutions. It's the opposite thing that I'm trying to say, which is we've stopped being curious, we've stopped being interested in the ways that young people and future generations might want to shape our democracy and our democratic institutions. And to me, the urgency is around trying to explore what our democratic institutions should or could look like if we're able to lean in and listen to be guided by younger people in terms of what counts as democratic engagement. So here are two of my three kids, and I'll put them up on the screen because often when we're thinking about things like democratic engagement in young people or voting in young people or policy and young people, we're often get a bit trapped in these kind of figures of youth. And there's been some scholarship on this that I've found really interesting. Threadgold is one of the authors that talks about these figures of youth and talks about three figures that sometimes dominate what we're talking about. So these figures include the idea of young people as figures of hope, that they're going to be, you know, these beacons of hope for the rest of us. Authors and scholars talk about the idea of young people as risk figures. Are they about to do something really risky? Are they unreliable decision makers in our community? And then there's the idea of young people as revolutionary figures, is another figure that can, or assumption, if you like, that can dominate our thinking. And all of these figures kind of suggest that young people are citizens in waiting. They're not yet fully empowered citizens that we need to take seriously in our democratic discourse. And what I'm interested in is the studies and the work that challenges these figures, that says actually all people should be considered as having indivisible and universal, undeniable human rights. All of the people in Australia, including young people like my kids on the screen here, if we imagine them not as citizens in the future, but citizens now, could that shift the way that we think about what counts as democratic engagement and what status and legitimacy and power we're going to attribute to young people in our community? And one of the reasons I'm really interested in the work that's been done in those spaces about testing assumptions around how we understand the role and identities of young people in our democratic polity is because I'm interested in these ideas of democratic engagement, democratic listening, and this concept of intergenerational resilience. So all of these are kind of sound like pretty potentially scholarly academic words that could be unpacked in PhDs, and they definitely are. But to break it down into things that I find compelling about these circles is really to say, for a long time, what we've imagined is a situation where people with knowledge and power, people in institutional settings are going to broadcast out messages or broadcast out processes, and then other people in the community respond to those messages or processes. And some of them are really integral to our concept of democracy and parliamentary democracy in Australia. And they can be powerful processes that define our democracy, like voting at elections. They can be really important starting points for having a discussion about what we want our community or our laws to look like the idea of a parliamentary committee where someone might receive some information about a committee inquiry and then put in a written submission. But if they're quite passive, and if they imagine someone as the teacher and someone as the learner, or someone as the decision maker and someone providing feedback, we never really get to the type of deliberative conversation where people change their mind. And it's those conditions that I think we need to strive for if we're going to reimagine what democratic engagement looks like, and if we're going to build this intergenerational resilience that I think we need to counter some of those threats of the perfect storm that have been articulated by many different people, including the Australian Home Affairs Department. So there are lots of people working hard in academia and on the ground to develop different strategies for trying to give meaning to those concepts with the type of work that they're doing alongside with young people, and most importantly, young people themselves are taking this action. And every time we talk about different categories of people, we have to kind of draw arbitrary lines, don't we? So when I talk about young people, I really don't want to put ages around that. But for most of the studies that I'm talking about, they would describe young people as being under 18. So the green shoots of innovation that I can see through the places that I've been to and in Australia and New Zealand are doing things like investing in civics education in a range of different settings. And they're trying to ensure that the civics education is evidence-based, that it is orientated around local place and is participatory. So an example is, oh, sorry, my lights have gone off. I'll just stand up and move around a bit. An example is the difference between a lesson where the teacher might describe how parliaments and democracy work and the students listen to that and write a report about it, moving to a completely different model where students are deciding within their classroom how they might make decisions together about things in their school and in their classroom environment, and how they might activate to identify areas of change in their community and practice democratic decision-making and democratic participation. There's also this important shift happening in youth advisory groups away from a kind of model of self-select, or we're going to select the best people because they've already been identified as being outstanding in their school, which is the model that we've seen happen for quite a long time, which is still a wonderful experience for the young people that are selected, but tends to favour the voices that have already got multiple points of privilege, and moving to a model where we're going to have more democratic or demographically diverse representation of young people. And in Scotland and Wales, for example, where they have a lower voting age, which means that 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds can vote, we also see great work being done with 12 to 15 and 16-year-olds, enabling them to actually run for an elected position among their own peers, and then generate their own platforms for change. So some of these green shoots of innovation show that flip from imagining young people as citizens of the future to an idea of imagining young people as citizens now. One of the things that I found in the travels that I was lucky enough to go on was that if we want to have a shift in reimagining what counts as youth democratic engagement, and if we want to rebuild our democratic institutions in a way that really serves current and future generations, we need a couple of different catalysts for change. And so the blocks on the bottom of this graphic that was done by a friend of mine, Richard Dahl, the numerical blocks, I guess, are the things that the institution can start to do, build in the foundations for change. But the image on this screen has these wind kind of elements, these weather elements that are, I guess, trying to indicate that we also need to be able to capitalize on the things that we can't necessarily control inside of an institution, so that we can create a cultural shift in the institutional settings that's about that democratic listening, rather than the idea of the institution broadcasting its own agenda for change. So some of the things that happened in the lead up to shifts in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, for example, were to do with big picture political shifts, including things like Brexit, COVID, but also devolution in the UK, which meant that the places like Scotland and Wales had more control over their own national identity and their own national decision making. And we also started to see some investment in the type of people and skills that were necessary to be able to do democratic listening inside and outside of the institutions. But if we don't have this shift in intergenerational quality when it comes to our substantive laws and policies, it is going to be a challenge. And what I mean by that is that part of this conception of young people as citizens of the future is the idea that they'll want to participate in our democracy just because we expect them to think democracy is great, or just because we expect young people to want to learn about something. But actually, younger people are thinking this system is broken for us because the structural, social, and economic settings are unfair, generationally unfair. And so when that happens, we can see how unrealistic it is to expect people to enthusiastically participate in a system as a learner when that same system is having an impact on their lives in a profound way through things like economic intergenerational inequality, or the way that young people might look at something like the climate change challenge. So I think this is why it's time to reconceptualize what counts as youth democratic engagement, and this might help us think about some of the laws and policies we're making. I'm going to move quickly onto this area of protest because I think it's an interesting example. So most people, most civics education teachers would not consider the idea of civil disobedience and protest as being at the core of the idea of democratic engagement. But in my view, this is the type of shift we absolutely need to see, which is to think about democratic participation as taking many different forms across different platforms and spaces. And if we think about it in that way, we can see that if we introduce laws and policies and send public messages that say protest is really bad and a criminal activity, that can have an impact on what people consider to be democratic engagement. Now, this is not to argue that all forms of protest should be lawful. I think thoughtful people have a range of different perspectives on where to draw the line, particularly if it comes to violence or harm to people or things. But one thing that is clear in my mind is that parliaments around the country have been introducing tougher and tougher new laws around protest, and those new laws target peaceful acts of protest, and they also have the potential to target young people expressing themselves in a range of different ways. And often young people engaged in those activities face barriers in understanding what their legal rights are and what the consequences might be of these new laws. So in South Australia, for example, lots of people talk about the idea that we might have a right to protest, and definitely under international law, we have that right. Perhaps as a moral right, as an ethical concept, we have that right. But when it comes to a law that would protect us, say, from criminal persecution or criminal liability, that right doesn't exist in South Australia. Instead, we have a broad criminal provision that makes it an offence to obstruct public place. And this can apply even if the person is not intending to be violent or disobedient in any way. So any form of school strike for climate, for example, would be captured by this kind of provision unless previous authorisation is sought from that group, from the authorities. And so if young people are feeling like it's very difficult for them to protest in our community without facing serious legal consequence, that sends a message about what we consider to be democratic engagement. The other thing that we tend to do as lawmakers and policymakers is a relatively paternalistic approach to policy making that has a disproportionate impact on young people's ability to be part of a democratic engagement and part of that democratic listening. So we see that with the social media discussion, and in South Australia, there's a discussion about a social media ban. And I think this is an interesting example where there's a policy objective that is based on something that the advocates and proponents of this change consider to be a protective, an important protective measure for children. And so the Premier in South Australia has been talked about this work by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, and used that as a starting point to discuss how important he thinks it is to ban or limit use of social media by young people. And the Premier had a summit about social media, but the voices of young people were really muted in that summit and have been really muted in the broader public discussion about this issue. Even though we know young people have a lot to say about this particular policy reform, I don't think our institutions are being very creative about the way that we seek input from young people. And I think that's because we're trapped still in that conception of young people as being citizens of the future, as being in need of protection, as being risk takers, rather than imagining them as citizens now. And definitely the kind of discourse we'd be having if we're talking about imposing this ban for older people would be different. And we can see that in real time through the other legislative measures that have been introduced at the same time that seek to regulate content on the media, on social media. So I think that we can use these ideas to really think differently about engagement at institutional level, that I would hope would be able to apply not just to parliaments and governments, but to any space where we're thinking of engaging with any group that isn't privileged in terms of their voice in the discussion. So I think that these kind of lessons that I learned from my travels could be applied beyond the youth context. But just to talk through a couple of them, we really need open curiosity about different generations. And that's what happened in Scotland and Ireland and Wales. They got high quality demographic data to say whose voices keep being heard and who's are missing. And that's why the Social Change Lab is such an inspiration to me, because that's the kind of work that I know you're doing. We need to kind of consider our social tolerance for youth-led social action. And try and resist the temptation for a reactionary response, even if the particular issue is something different to what we might have advocated before. And I find this hard. I find it really hard because whilst something like climate, I feel very ready to embrace and celebrate protest activity. There's other issues, perhaps a recent example in South Australia is abortion, where I might have a strong different position to the people protesting. And that's a challenge to me to try and walk this talk on those issues. But to me, it's integral to broaden that idea as legitimate democratic participation. And I think the concept of franchise, which I know Ed will talk about, is critical to this debate too. So we can't have dress up and pretend in any of this. If people's voices are going to be part of democratic listening and develop that intergenerational resilience, They have to have political and demographically representative power. So that's the shift that happened in the UK. When young people are elected with a mandate, they're taken seriously by other political decision makers. If they're self-selected because they're the captain of their school, they can still do amazing things, but they are not going to be able to bring with them that mandate for change that's recognised in our political discourse. And so I think I'll just leave it there. I'm at time. I just wanted to say again how grateful I am for the opportunity to talk to young people about their perspectives on this. And I can't wait to hear what Ed's got to say about the great work that Run For It does.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It was really wonderful to hear your perspectives, and I especially really appreciated this idea that, young people are not citizens in waiting, they're citizens right now. Okay, next up we have Ed Krutsch, who cut his teeth campaigning with the school strikes for climate rallies in 2018. And since then, he's led a number of grassroots election campaigns and worked for state and federal MPs. He's passionate about changing the way democracy looks in Australia and raising the voices of young Australians in politics. He's currently the National Director at Run For It, based on Wurundjeri country in Naarm, Melbourne, which is an independent, non-partisan political organisation run by young people for young people, working towards better policy outcomes for future and current generations. Run For It achieves this by training and encouraging young leaders to take on election campaigns as candidates and community organisers, increasing the amount of young people voting and actively engaging in democracy, and fighting for a fairer system for young people in politics. So thanks so much, Ed. Let me just pin your video.
And Sarah, that was really great. Thank you for that presentation. Should I share some thoughts and chat about Sarah's presentation now, or dive straight into mine?
Dive into your presentation now, and then once you're finished, we'll get Sarah to respond to you, and then you in turn will respond to Sarah, and then we'll open up to everybody else.
Wonderful. I'm just going to find my presentation and share that. Won't be a minute. All right. That's just loading for me, but should be there. Can you all see that now? Wonderful. All right. Yeah. So I'm Ed, and lovely to be chatting to all of you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Run For It does and what I do as well. I'm not an academic. I enjoy engaging with research and thinking about this issue a lot, but yeah, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the work we do with young people, and it might not be super academic-y, but I'll try my best. But yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country as well. So I'm based in Naarm, Melbourne, and also acknowledge that with a lot of the topics that I'm going to talk about, so voting and running for election, they're things that were denied to First Nations people for so long, and also talking about youth organising and young people and the role that First Nations young people play in our movements, and the need to centre young First Nations people's voices in our movement and in our work to reshape our democracy. So a little bit about Run For It and the work that we do. We're a youth-led social change movement we've been established kind of as a group of young people involved in a whole bunch of social movements, climate change, anti-poverty, just different things that young people care about. And we've all kind of come together, acknowledging that democracy isn't really meeting the needs of young people, and that there's a whole lot of factors within our kind of formal structures that act as barriers to young people's meaningful participation. And we've chosen a few ways that we think young people could be better represented and better participate in our democracy. And then the goal is to work amongst our peers actively to campaign and organise to kind of force that better relationship between young people and our democracy. We have a few values that we are aligned to. So we work with young people who care about climate justice, social justice, economic justice, acknowledging that they're big things that young people care about. And then that kind of shapes a lot of the work that we do. So if we're supporting a young candidate who might be running for council, we're fully non-partisan, but we want to make sure that we're aligned about these big kind of issues of justice that young people care about, and that vision for the future. So as I was just mentioning there, some of the work that we do is training and encouraging young people to take on election campaigns as candidates. You can see here's a map of our recent Victorian local government elections. We supported about 25 young people across the state of Victoria, and before that we ran a New South Wales campaign. So they're people who are aged between 18 and 35, often running for council for the first time, and we work with them to kind of develop a platform, to develop a campaign, and just get them that equal footing with more established candidates. We know at council level they can lean a lot older. Some councils are made up entirely of some of them, even in these regional areas. You can see we had candidates in places like Swan Hill and Echuca. You'll see councils made up of entirely older white men over 60, and the impact of having a younger person, someone who's in their 20s and using services, maybe like the childcare or the swimming pools or the libraries, really makes a big impact on what those communities look like and what the democratic decision-making looks like on those local councils. We also run these workshops. So this is our piece to kind of increase the amount of young people engaging with voting and democracy. Sometimes we call this, it's a bit American, but like get out the vote type work. So around elections, making sure young people know they're on, particularly council elections, and making sure young people feel like they're properly resourced to go into the voting booth and cast a ballot. They understand how the system works and what they're doing, and also how they can engage outside of just voting and running as well. So maybe how they can lobby their local MP and just be involved in these quite formal parts of our democracy. And then as well, we have another feature of our work, fighting for a fairer system for young people in our democracy. And here are some photos from the Make It 16 campaign, which is the main piece of work that we do in this area, fighting to lower the voting age to 16. So last year, we established a fully 16 and 17-year-old led campaign. So you can see in the top left, there are photos of those 16 and 17-year-olds launching that campaign in Canberra. And the vision was that we as a youth movement were mainly people at university campaigning for our democracy, but the movement to lower the voting age to 16 needed to be run by those who are going to be impacted. So we gave them all of the resources that they needed. I supported them to essentially establish the campaign. Then they set their own strategy, set their own budget, and fully establish their own youth-led campaign for that change, which we're still fighting for, and hopefully we'll one day get to it. And I'll come back to it a little bit. But all of this work that we do, I just wanted to kind of talk about the terminology of organising. We consider this work that we do engaging in our young people in our democracy as youth organising. So if you're familiar with community organising, which I put a brief definition at the top there, we specifically talk about our work as youth organising. So there's a beautiful quote there from Monica Cordova, who runs the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organising, which is an American body. We don't have anything like that in Australia, who focus specifically on youth-led social movements and resourcing them, which is obviously so important. And the quote here, young people aren't satisfied with incremental change, they'll put themselves on the front line for the betterment of the whole community, I think really summarises why we specifically do youth organising, that beautiful vision that young people have for their future and for the systems that are around them is really special, and young people will really fight for that. And we need to kind of, we need to keep fighting to make sure the systems have all those entry points so young people can have their voice heard and engage with our democracy and our systems. I thought I should probably try and very quickly answer this question, what counts as legitimate democratic participation, and then I'm going to pivot to kind of where some of my work and thinking is on this. But obviously there are so many things that forward to democratic participation, so many things that young people are doing. Some listed here are more formal than others, like going to a march or rally. Young people may not know they're participating in our democracy. It might just be for an issue that they really care about. But obviously that is them participating in our democracy. And then there are often, and especially with the Make It 16 campaign, we've seen it, young people who are really politically active and they're forming their own groups and campaigns, or they're joining the youth wings of political parties, or they're actively lobbying, which is really, really exciting. And all of these things do underpin our democracy and are so critical. But the challenge that I see and that kind of Run for It works with in a representative space is that they don't really equate to a form of representation. They're, of course, meaningful ways of participating in our democracy and really important protest and civil society. But as Run for It, we work with these quite formal mechanisms of participation that also underpin our democracy. That's the ability to run an election, the ability to vote. We know that these are protected in international law, but at the moment they're restricted to that age of 18. So that's why we run that Make It 16 campaign around lowering the voting age and do that work around engaging more young people. In a moment, I'll talk about what happens when we do actually lower the voting age as well. But now I'll just touch on kind of where the system is at in terms of these ways that we represent young people in our democracy as well. We here as a youth movement, we try to engage young people doing things on university campuses and online, actively engaging young people in their democracy. And we get the opportunity often to speak to them about maybe if they're not so interested in what we're talking about, or they didn't know there's an election coming up or something like that, we commonly want to know like why they don't see politics as something for them, or what's kind of led to their lack of desire to participate, and as kind of Sarah said before, why they might see themselves as citizens in waiting. And these are kind of the key three issues that I just wanted to point out. They often don't feel like they're listened to, or that they would be listened to. So if they had something to say, they don't see that there would be anyone who actually cares. And I think that's particularly shaped by like young people around the time of their first instance of voting. They've been in a school system, they haven't had the ability to vote. They've actually developed this kind of this mindset that their voice doesn't matter and that nobody's really listening to that. That is a real shame. Often young people, when they think of politics, the first thing that comes to them is older white men in suits. It's not something that looks like them. It doesn't interact with their lives. They don't feel it represents them. It's something that represents working people. And then that links us to kind of that third issues. They don't talk about the things that young people talk about. So the reason why Run for It focuses on those kind of key issues of justice is that young people tend to really get that. Young people often have a really strong sense of justice. They understand that there are these big injustices, whether it's our economy, whether it's climate change, or whether it's other issues of social justice. And they see kind of politics as often having this narrow vision of taxes, interest rates, and kind of big level reforms that don't interact with young people's everyday lives. But obviously that's wrong. So we see it kind of, or I see it as quite critical for these barriers to participation, to be fixed. The deficits of kind of the representation needs to be fixed. So that often looks like the work that we do that elects more young people, and also finding better ways to represent young people who may not be able to run for election and things like that as well. So we know at the moment there's a few structures to represent young people. There are commissioners for young people. We have guardians in some states. We have children's ombudsmen, different kind of structures that protect usually the legal rights of young people at risk. So in some states, they do a bit more work that actively is focused on engagement and participation, but in other places it's not. We obviously have a Minister for Youth, unfortunately no Federal Minister for Children, but we have these structures that are adults essentially aiming to represent the interests of young people. And people often talk about, when you bring this up, the role of other voting people, so parents and grandparents representing the interests of young people. They even talk about like proxy votes, so giving giving an adult with an additional vote. None of these actually address that lack of representation that young people are facing, that creates that lack of participation as well. We also have these programs. So Sarah spoke a little bit about youth advisory groups. We know that the federal government at the moment runs a few youth advisory groups. There's the Raise Our Voice in Parliament, youth parliaments, national schools, constitutional convention, which are all really great civic engagement programs. And they're raising the voices of young people, but they aren't necessarily getting that kind of input in policy making, or young people are not getting that self-representation on the issues that really matter to them, or any kind of decision making. So I'm going to talk about now how we can kind of build that voice for young people, and how we can make that shift so that there can be that type of representation that hopefully legitimizes that participation and creates that culture of democratic participation in young people as well. So as I was speaking before, one of the first steps that I think is so critical to creating this culture of democracy amongst young people is lowering the voting age to 16. That's why we run the Make It 16 campaign. As it says here, it's not that groundbreaking of an idea. We know that lots of countries have done it before, and there are huge benefits when it happens. So young people who vote, especially when they're in the schooling system for the first time, they are more likely to have really strong civics education, so that they understand what they're doing. There's that kind of impetus on the education system. And we also just see that when you're 16 and 17 and you're maybe living at home, you haven't moved out to university or something like that, you develop the habit of democratic participation much stronger than, say, when you're 18 or 19, you don't have these supports around you and you're voting for the first time. So we definitely think we should lower the voting age to 16, and also the age of candidacy as well. We see that as a bit of a next step. I think lowering the voting age is a bit more palatable to our politicians at the moment, so that's the focus. But if young people are voting, they should also be able to elect their peers of the same age as well. But it kind of does beg the question of what about those under 16? And there are some abroad, people like David Runciman, who talk about lowering the voting age all the way down to 0 or to 6 or something, which are great ideas, but again, maybe just not quite palatable to our politicians at the moment. So I'm going to focus a little bit on how we can build a kind of participatory civics education system that is a mechanism for representation as well, so that those under 16 can have that kind of representation and actual say in decision making, and feel like they're not citizens in waiting, or feel that politics is adults' territory, but might not also be quite in that legal age for voting or running for election. I'm going to talk about a few of the structures that exist at the moment that straddle a bit of a line, but maybe don't quite get that decision-making power at the moment. Youth parliaments are a really fantastic program that run mostly around most of Australia, often in the school holidays. In state parliaments, young people identify issues that are important to them and debate them. I was involved in the Northern Territory establishing their first youth parliament last year, and that was a really fantastic example of what the program is designed to do. Young people who lived in a whole bunch of communities, especially remote communities, came together in the Northern Territory Assembly, and they came up with issues that were important to young people in their communities. And these were really diverse issues, but of just such direct relevance to the young people. Things like one community not having a morgue, one community struggling a lot with smoking and vaping, and things that young people were generally experiencing. They got to come to Darwin and essentially design bills and policy that would resolve these challenges in their communities. Unfortunately, it doesn't really go anywhere. It's a civic engagement program, and these young people come up with the solutions and they don't necessarily turn into policy, but it builds a strong base for the ways that young people can engage with our democracy and identify the issues in their communities and collaboratively design solutions. There's a program that the Foundation for Young Australians run as well, the Young Mayors, and Sarah kind of touched on civics education being participatory. And to me, this is kind of the best example of a participatory civics education program. This is where young people democratically elect, usually through schools, their peers to a Young Mayors program. So the Foundation for Young Australia has run it, I think, in Mackay, Horsham, and they've rolled it out in a few other places, maybe Townsville and Wollongong, where they get the schools to participate. That you can see there that 1,464 young people voted in Mackay to elect 12 people aged, it's 11 to 17, onto their Young Mayors, who then become essentially a little bit like a youth advisory group, but ideally they have a bit more power than they do traditionally, and they're able to make decisions for what they want their community to look like. One really exciting thing about this program is it teaches those skills of democratic participation to young people that like the Run For It workshops do, how to actually complete a ballot and how to participate in those formal parts of our democracy. But then sometimes, without the young people realising it, it also teaches them those civic skills that they don't necessarily understand as legitimate democratic participation. So a really key one, particularly in recent times, has been the identification of things like misinformation and disinformation in election campaigns, being able to make an analysis between two different candidates and the things that they're saying and what they actually might think is the truth or accurate and not, and also protest and things like that when they're unhappy with things that their peers might be saying or doing. And a lot of young people's civic engagement has expanded when they participate in these programs. They start to do things like develop petitions, or they want to go and lobby their federal and state MPs or their actual elected councillors. So essentially, once we've lowered the voting age, I think that there's a really strong opportunity for Australia to develop a national youth parliament that kind of sits as a body that young people participate in and are elected to. So it's a bit of a pipe dream, but how I imagine something like this working is if lots of places, more than just Mackay and Townsville and Horsham, had Young Mayors programs, there's through schools and through local councils, really strong participatory civics education that directly elects peers. And then these young people who are elected to the Young Mayors can essentially have a representative or something like that who participate in national or maybe just statewide youth parliamentary processes, which in some other countries have been given genuine deliberative power to make decisions that are relevant to young people. And we know at the moment there are things like the social media ban and also issues like climate change that a youth voice, where there's also that element of representative democracy, having an engagement with these kind of policy-making decisions would just be so powerful. So yeah, I think the example of Sri Lanka and so many other countries where they've actually genuinely built these models that have the ability for young people to represent themselves. Yeah, and then the final part of my presentation is just around the election of young people. So we definitely see a really strong correlation between the lack of participatory civics programs for young people and the amount of young people who are elected. There's very few people in Australia elected in that kind of age bracket between 18 and 25, almost none. There's a very small handful between 25 and 35, but generally under 35 there's not many young people in our parliaments or our councils. We see that as caused by a lack of those programs like the Young Mayors, like youth parliaments. Young people haven't engaged with democracy. They see it as adult territory. They haven't had that experience of being able to identify the issues in their communities and seeing democracy as an avenue for change. There's a few other elements to getting young people elected that also surround just making the system fair as well. We know that there's some vested interest in our democracy, and things like campaign fundraising can be really hard, and it's actually not necessarily the fairest playing field at the moment as well. So that's kind of a final policy piece as well, that we actually need to make sure our elections are fair, and that for young people to run, they have to want to, but then they also have to have a fighting chance as well. That kind of brings me towards the end of my presentation, and hoping to answer some questions and chat more about it with Sarah. But ultimately, that's my big vision for how we can legitimise that democratic participation through getting that greater representation of young people in our democracy.
Thanks very much, Ed and Sarah, and the room is re-applauding so that you can hear. What fascinating talks. In the PEPSS program, we normally now have a commentary by each speaker on the other speaker, as Charlie said. So Sarah, over to you for some thoughts and reflections on Ed's work and, you know, on the ways that you responded to it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ed. I thought that you were able to give a kind of real world insight into some of the scholarly ideas that I've been exploring in my research. So thank you so much for that. One of the things that's really interesting when we look at those models that you described around representation and elected youth voices is the extent to which the young people that go through those experiences then seek to, I guess, learn the ropes of the existing system and use it to advance the interests of the young people that they've built up a constituency around, compared to the people who kind of learn the ropes and then think we have to change the system completely because it lacks legitimacy for me. And there's two examples that I'd love your reflections on that to me speak to both of those experiences in different ways. One is an example from New Zealand where they had a young mayor's program, and someone was elected from a regional area, had, I'd say definitely a kind of relatively what might be described as conservative agenda, but servicing the young people in their community around certain issues that they were experiencing, and had a strong mandate and a number of talents in terms of being able to communicate that in council. And once they were a young mayor, they actually realised that they went through all the bylaws of the council and found this one committee where they would actually have a binding vote. And they actually developed a strategy so that in this planning committee, they were able to block the rest of the council. And they used that vote to say, until you actually take action on some of our youth agenda, we are going to block your planning committee's progress because your bylaws have got a flaw in them that mean even though we're not real councillors, we still get a binding vote. So they use the system, I guess, to get some political credibility for their mandate. Then on the other side was an experience that I heard about in Scotland, where young people were elected to a youth parliament there. They were 15 and it was all going well. They were having the chance to get information from parliamentarians and departments, but a couple of the members of that youth parliament really didn't like the restrictions that were placed on them for social media. And so they broke those rules and they went completely against the rules, communicated their own position all over social media, left the youth parliament program, and then promptly were elected as soon as they were old enough. So I'm interested in your thoughts on, like, what would we consider to be the goal of some of these programs, and would you count those different experiences as kind of success from a Run For It point of view? And how do you grapple with that challenge? Like, what does the kind of job done tick look like for Run For It is perhaps my question, but deep gratitude for the excellent presentation. I loved it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And I guess that's democracy with those two examples. Like there's probably a strong role for our existing parliamentarians in also being strong role models as well. Like sometimes we see in these programs, like the ones that you mentioned, young people behaving in less than desirable ways, but often they're just replicating what they see on the floors of our federal parliament or something, speaking over other young people and things like that. But developing what can be a more deliberative and a more or a less antagonistic type of politics and democracy, I think, is really important, but also understanding that young people don't fit into neat buckets of kind of sitting, listening, and just participating in the systems that have been structured for them. But there is a huge diversity of views, and that they essentially need to be respected for that diversity, and our systems need to kind of include that. But yeah, hopefully that kind of answers that question. And there's some of those natural kind of challenges that come with those programs as well, and working with young people, that kind of the challenges that you have in all the things that are happening in a young person's life, as well as these democratic programs and participatory programs. I found one thing interesting from yours, Sarah, in terms of the youth, those green shoots of innovations, and in terms of all of those existing programs. I think there's quite a outlying challenge in how we also make all of those programs, whether it's a youth advisory committee or the participatory civics education programs, have that genuine power, whether it's kind of like handing over of a budget or certain decision-making things. It feels like something quite far removed from the stage that we're at the moment, and also a lot of the existing programs. So I think the best that I've seen is, like, sometimes there are budgets that are provided to these groups for them to do kind of small youth-based programs. So maybe they'll run music events, or they're given money to have like a youth space or something like that, and they get to decide how that is spent. But obviously there are so many other things in our communities that impact young people's lives, that there is the opportunity that they could be making their own decisions on. And I think that's kind of an outstanding challenge, to understand how much could actually be put into the hands of young people, and who also gets to determine that as well, because then you see those problems like the young people with social media rules, that is like, well, you as the adults are still here determining for us what we have control of and not, and what you feel is kind of safe for young people to be determining. But there are actually so many big things, like climate change being a key example, that are huge and probably have the most significant impact on younger people.
Yeah, thank you both. Such great points. So where we're going to go now is towards a question and answer, but also broader discussion. And appropriate to this topic, we actually have a tradition that the first comment or question should come from a student. I'm not sure if we reach under 18s, but in our audience, if there are any such, you are very welcome. So please put your hand up if you're a student and you've got a question or comment for our great speakers. We'll start with you. And Zoomers, I'm going to welcome you as well to raise your hand in the Zoom, or to type something into the chat as you prefer. Let's see if I can bring this chat up. Is that, I feel like Charlie will wait and see if there's someone other than our organizing youth. Although you are definitely first on the list from our in-group. Oh, there we go, Axel. Over to you, Axel.
Cool.
Sorry, let me just check. Zoomers, can you hear Axel if he speaks?
If I speak from
Yep.
here? Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for a great talk, both of you. I have a question for Sarah. And it's a little thing you mentioned earlier in your talk about how participation is decreasing or isn't what it used to be. And I'm sort of interested to know, as a young person, I haven't seen that change, and what you see has changed and why young people are less engaged than before. I know there's a discussion around sort of party affiliations decreasing, but I don't necessarily see that as an issue with young people. So yeah, I just wanted to get a bit more of a background from you.
Okay.
What has changed.
And before you get to that, I've just had a request in the chat to repeat the question. So it was basically, what's the basis for the assertion that there's declining engagement by young people? Because Axel was commenting that he's not sure he's actually seen that himself. Sarah, Ed, do either of you guys want to speak or both?
I don't mind going first. So yeah, you've touched on an excellent point. So what the research is saying is a complex picture. So there's been studies on this idea of, do you trust institutions like Parliament and government? And there we've seen a move kind of flow up and down in Australia. So it was going on the down, and then COVID had a little spike for a little while, and then it went down again as a general population. Then we see, so that's why I guess we get that headline that is our democracy in trouble because people are not trusting these systems anymore. But with the youth engagement part, I definitely don't think we've seen a decrease in engagement. I'm trying to argue that if we take a broader view of what democratic engagement is, we see an absolutely enthusiastic and varied and diverse interest in democracy from young people. But there is data from the Electoral Commission, at least the data that's a colleague here in South Australia has shared with me, that does show that there are declines in participation in elections from young people. And so there is some data around that. So I guess it depends how you measure it, and the Social Change Lab has measured it in different ways and gives a rich picture. I think what I'm trying to get to with my conversation is that if we say that all that counts is that question, do you trust government or do you trust Parliament, or have you signed a petition, or did you vote formally, that's going to be a big problem, a problem for understanding what it is that this younger generation is looking for when it comes to improving our democracy. Yeah, but great question.
Yeah, great answer. Ed, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, I would probably say like that. I'd agree in terms of participation that it does go up and down a little bit, but would also just flag as well, like representation has almost always been low. Young people haven't been elected before, and that's kind of work that we're just at the beginning of, is beginning to understand what young people have to add to our policy debates and creating representation that we haven't traditionally seen. Like in our work at Run For It, it's a lot of firsts. It's like the first person under 30 elected onto a council first. But I think we have so much work to kind of stop talking through these firsts and also just thinking about what that genuine representation of all people and their interests looks like in our democracy.
Thanks very much, Ed. I'm just going to go to Eleanor's question. And Eleanor, I'm going to assume that you wanted me to read it since you put it in the chat. But if you wanted to speak to it, or anyone wants to speak to their own question, you can just raise your hand using the Zoom function. So Eleanor says, I was wondering what your thoughts or observations were on the importance and potential in promoting a culture of political and societal participation outside of the inherently exclusionary political systems. Is there space for encouraging both top-down institutional participation and bottom-up community action? And could you talk about any patterns you've identified? Sounds like a great question, Eleanor. Ed or Sarah, or both?
Did you want to go first, Ed? Or?
Yeah, okay. I think the only thing that I would just say briefly is around that slide I had on community organizing and youth organizing, and linking that to also the points that you were making around protests, Sarah, and the wider participation in our democracy, and just the need to also create the environment for that kind of participation. So like restrictions on protests are like totally unacceptable. That's how we participate in our democracy, and also how we identify the things that people care the most strongly about, and particularly those that maybe don't have the ability to vote, don't have the ability to run for parliament. And that's so important. But I think also important is that young people can participate in organising, and that there's the narratives that's meaningful democratic participation as well. So that's organising in their communities and organising kind of in wider social movements as well. And there's a small role that like our education systems play in that. So like having programs like the Young Mayors are really critical, that show young people what that kind of democratic participation can look like. If we have education that does talk adequately to the role of social movements in our history and in change making, and then also just making sure that there are the environments for young people to meaningfully organise and participate in community campaigns and things that they care about. There can't be kind of restrictions on young people raising their voice on the things that they care about.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll just add into that an example that stuck with me from some time I spent in Manchester. So in Manchester, it's a really interesting place. They want to be a city that thinks about the rights of the child. They've been acknowledged internationally for that. But it's also a place where, when I was there at least 2 years ago, 46% of children are living below the poverty line. And one particular ward of the broader Manchester City Council, they kind of hit rock bottom when it came to youth justice. There was so many difficult problems that they tried something kind of out of left field. And what they did was they gave no strings attached funding to young people who have had multiple encounters with both health services and police. So they literally gave money, no strings attached, to these young people. And they said, come back to us in a month. We're interested in your life. And these young people came back, and the conversation was, here's the next lot of money. If you want to come back and tell us about what would make a difference in your community for young people, we'd love to hear it. And the second lot of money was used to pay for some of the young people in their neighbourhood to get driver's licenses. And then they came back, and then they talked about how they needed an asset, a young person's asset that they could make money from themselves. And so the City Council enabled them to lease one of the hall facilities in that community. And then the young people were literally in control of who could use that facility and the money that came in from that facility. And this process was democratic decision making. And it led to a couple of those young people then being on panels for the employment of council members for youth strategy. So that is maybe, I don't know, an example of where democratic decision-making empowerment doesn't have to be politics, right? But the trust that was the symbol of that trust was the turning point. And so I'm really interested in programs like that, but it is fair to say that they were at a rock bottom point, and you'd hate that to be where we'd have to get to before we tried something like that. Thanks.
What a fabulous program in Manchester. Megan, I saw your question in the chat, but before I go to you, I'm going to go to Charlie. And I'm just going to say, Charlie, when you start speaking, if you could just mention the data that Sarah was referencing there that we have on young people and democracy, and in particular, Well, the 30-second version I would say is it's not so nuanced as to say young people don't support democracy. There's actually another important factor. But you probably had a totally separate question. So can you please do both? Over to you, Charlie.
I did have a totally separate question. Do you want me to speak?
Yeah, do you want to come up and just do a sort of 30-second version on your data, or do you feel annoyed and resentful?
I don't feel annoyed or resentful at all. Sorry, I was actually really hard thinking about my question in the last few words that you were saying, Sarah. So I'm not into, like, you want me to talk about the temporal orientation stuff with our data?
Yeah.
So we were looking at the relationship between various social and political predictors and attitudes towards democracy. And we were also exploring the role that people's orientation to the present and the future played. And so we found this really interesting relationship in the first wave of our Queensland data that showed that young people who were present oriented have a very different relationship to like democratic systems than young people who are future oriented. So when we've got this like focus on the short term, they are much less supportive of democratic institutions and much more willing to extend support to things like authoritarian leaders and other things like that are sort of sit outside of democratic institutions than people who are, you know, forward thinking.
Yeah, that was cool. And it was like support for protester violence and support for police violence. So that was really interesting for us, thinking about just this message that I guess both Sarah and Ed have highlighted, that young people are not all the same. And in fact, part of empowering them is recognizing their diversity and the reality of that. Okay, to your real question, Charlie.
Which I guess actually does kind of link in now. My question for you both, I guess, is you both spoke about the sort of various lower the vote campaigns within Australia and outside of Australia. And I guess my question is, like, first of all, what do you think it will take for us to get the voting age to be lowered to 16 in Australia? But also what do you think it will take for not only sort of policymakers, but also society at large to accept that if that happens, then we also have to take like a hands-off role to what that looks like, right? And accept that sometimes that's going to look potentially more antagonistic, to reference like sort of earlier comments. Yeah, I would love to hear what you think.
Great. Over to you, Sarah and Ed.
Do you want to go first this time, Sarah?
Sure, I'll try and be quick. I love that question. In terms of what it would take, this is where I get to talk about the law, which I haven't got to do much. I mean, the wonderful thing is we don't need a referendum. That's one thing. So we could do this by legislation. And in New Zealand, young people have gone to court and said this age limit on voting is discriminatory. And they got some judicial acknowledgement of that argument. We've had the legislation drawn up. It's not very complicated, and it's been to inquiry at the federal level. What it would take, in my view, is an Australian state doing it first, so that everyone can see that it's not too scary. And I also think it would take what Ed's talking about, which is an overall increase in young people in elected positions in Parliament and in councils. And when I was in the UK, there was some really interesting discussion there about quotas for young people. And so just like the efforts that have been taken to encourage women to run for office and be elected, that then broadens the support base for this. So I think we need that slide I had with the cartoon image. We need the institutional bits putting in, which is keep having the inquiries, keep giving the evidence, and we need to capitalise on the winds of opportunity that are going to flow, so that we can be truly this innovative federation where when one place does it, everyone looks and sees that's not so scary. That's what I think. But I do agree. So in Scotland and Wales and in Europe, giving young people the vote doesn't mean, for example, progressives get everything. Absolutely not. So I think that is something that's important to keep in mind.
Thanks, Sarah. Ed?
Yeah, definitely. All of those things. And I guess to be blunt as well, it takes a bit of political willpower. There has to be a party who can look beyond the electoral impacts. That tends to be the number one barrier at the moment, is people are concerned around it's about 600,000 young people, how they'll vote and what that'll change to the national electorate, but that's totally irrelevant. We don't consider that in any other suffrage movements, and it's just not how democracy is structured. So that kind of that type of politics, I think, is what is really needed, that isn't so short term, but actually does look to the future. And then when we have that modelled by our parliamentarians, that there is that kind of policy making that does give respect to our democracy and democratic values, and also looks to the future, I think that also helps to resolve some of those challenges that you were raising, Charlie, around young people tending towards authoritarianism and feeling disillusioned with the current status of democracy. It's, in my view, a lot of that is caused by that kind of antagonistic nature of our democracy at the moment, and these kind of the short-termism by a lot of our politicians, that a lot of people do just feel quite fed up with that, and young people don't see that as change, but then they do see political violence or authoritarianism or kind of these forms of extremism as avenues for change. But it just takes our politicians kind of, being a little bit brave. I think the other thing that we touched on briefly earlier that's really important to flag as well is just around the material status of young people as well. When there is that kind of inequality, intergenerational or equality, and young people do feel more hard done by than other age groups and other generations, or they kind of feel like they have it a bit rough. I think there's also that lack of faith in democracy comes from that place, and it's just so critical that we have that faith in our democracy being able to kind of deliver those better outcomes for everybody, and also increasing the material conditions of young people, like Sarah was talking about, in terms of the group of young people in Manchester, does just increase their participation. Young people who have the ability to participate are more likely to participate, and there are creative ways that, particularly young people who are more at risk or more financially disadvantaged, we need to find ways that we can raise their material conditions and kind of create that participation that Sarah was talking about.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mean, I think in other areas of our political conversations, if a group is kind of disadvantaged, then it's really obvious that part of the cause of that is their marginalization. So it's interesting that we look at like youth disengagement and perhaps like suicidality, depression, anxiety, but we don't ask in what ways are they structurally marginalized, and in what ways could their structural empowerment solve these problems that we profess to care about. Super interesting. A question that Megan raises is, young people seem to get their political information on social media. How can they be reached and engaged or educated on how to digest this information? And, is there a place, I think this is continuation of this idea of engaging youth parliaments and workshops within schools and within our education system? Over to you, Ed and Sarah.
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I forgot to say something before that might feed into this a little bit too. In the UK, one of the things that they did as a precursor to their voting franchise is they collected information from young people at the same time as the elections were being run at council level and across the nation. So at the time the parents were going to vote, the kids were going to give information about the issues that are important to them. And that information was synthesized electorate by electorate, so that the person that gets elected to that place, like I live in the Adelaide Hills, the person who gets elected to the Adelaide Hills also walks away effectively with what the kids of the Adelaide Hills think, or the young people of Adelaide Hills think. And that becomes politically powerful information for that newly elected representative. And I think and then that gives some kind of, political clout to what young people think at the time when those elected members are focused on their constituency. And I think this feeds into this idea of what we're asking kids to do at school, and what it means to do civics education. One of the techniques that teachers that are interested in funds of knowledge pedagogy, which is the idea that we respect every person as already having knowledge to share rather than being a learner, is the idea that you would just say, okay, the people in this classroom, you take charge of the civics education. What is civics for you? What is this community that we're sitting in? Who's exercising power at the moment? How are we going to make decisions about our learning, about our world, and to really model that transfer of power from the adult to the child? And when that happens, that's the kind of learning. We know this because teachers are doing it all over the place in other areas like maths or whatever. But we tend to be nervous about this in school curriculums because it's somehow seen as, you know, political or something. And so I think when those strategies are employed, it's the kind of thing that we need to see. But I do have I do think with this debate we're having at the moment about social media, I think if we were saying to the adult community, we're going to ban you from using social media because the risks to you are too high, the arguments that would come back is, but we need to be able to talk about our public life together. And that argument would get credibility in political discourse. It seems like when we're talking about young people, we are focused on the kind of paternalistic approach of risk instead of understanding the impact that this could have on their citizenship. And so I think that is a challenge for us to think about. And yeah, I think that if we are to suggest that somehow social media is not a good enough landscape to communicate about politics and public life, we are seriously misunderstanding what the world's going to look like. And young people know that because they will not be deterred from this. It's just that the message I think we send, and I was at this summit here in South Australia, and it was such a powerful message because no young people were able to talk about what they thought on this issue. So in that situation, they go through the school system, they learn about civics, they learn about petitions, they learn about the suffragettes, they learn about these kind of things. And then when it comes to wanting to say something about an issue that impacts their citizenry, they're silenced. So I think curriculum is only going to work if we model that power shift. Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Ed?
Definitely. And I think it probably comes back just on the social media stuff as well to the skills that we give young people. So like the Young Mayors program, for example, the ability to identify misinformation and disinformation and how we actually think about the roles of these things in our democracy and then weave that into those participatory programs. I think that that's really critical. And yeah, definitely think that if we do focus on giving the young people these skills, then there's no need to ban young people from anything. Yeah, that's just, it's very paternalistic policy making, which I think is a lot of the challenge with the way that decision making for young people looks at the moment. There isn't that engagement of young people, and it means that essentially everything is made through this kind of protective paternalistic lens, and then that creates the narrative of young people as citizens of the future, and politics and our democracy is kind of adults only territory.
Yeah, it's sort of this recurring problem where you know, a disadvantaged group is to be further, you know, silenced, marginalized, and controlled in order to solve their problems. It just does not work from a systemic perspective. I think this will probably have to be our last question from Emmeline, who comments, "Thanks for the fabulous presentation, super interesting. Just wondering how gender dynamics play a role in this. Have you noticed any differences in how young women and gender diverse people versus young men engage in these programs and their overall democratic participation? Ed and Sarah, over to you.
I can go really quickly and then pass to Sarah that, as you can probably expect, a lot of the issues that we see role modeled in our formal elected politics also play out among the programs in young people. And there is so much work to actually change what representation looks like, and then also role modeling that better type of politics before we will see any kind of change in young people's dynamics themselves. Like anecdotally, I know that in the young mayors program, they see a dominance of young males elected. So the participation tends to be quite broad, but then when it comes to voting, more boys get up than girls. So pass to you.
Yep. Sad.
I think an interesting model is in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where they have democratic election of both. So 16-year-olds can vote, but they also have a youth parliament from 11 up that's democratically elected. And they elect around geographic constituencies. But one of the things that they do is they kind of save a quota of that parliament for historically marginalised groups. And they have a process of working with civil society and researchers to get really up-to-date data about that experience of marginalisation. And then they have the opportunity to kind of fill those quotas of diversity if they haven't been met through the election of those young people. And that's meant, for example, people with disabilities and gender diverse candidates have been able to be, have a powerful voice in those forums. So I think that would be great. But I've also noticed amongst my own anecdotal only experience teaching law students and doing some work at high schools in that 11 and 12 area, is actually a bit of the reverse of what Ed said. But in self-selection, young women are often in leadership positions in co-ed schools, very articulate and meeting a number of the merit-based criteria that would usually be used to think this person should have an opportunity here around, leadership and engagement. And as a result of that, I think a voice that we don't have enough curiosity about is young men who feel frustrated about institutional decision-making. And so I think that there is a blind spot sometimes in the communication and opportunity reward elements of these programs for that cohort. But I need to do some more research about that. It's just a vibe I'm getting. So I think it's an excellent question and something that maybe the Social Change Lab and I can keep talking about, because maybe you've already got that data.
Yeah, that's what I was just curious. I know that in Charlie's data, if I could speak for you, Charlie, the gender support for democracy was such that men sometimes had lower support, but it wasn't consistent, and it was trumped by the future orientation. So future-oriented men and women were more supportive of democracy, and present-oriented men and women were more supportive of political violence and authoritarianism. So I think that's an interesting question as to where those orientations come from and how they're reinforced in our schools and in our families and social systems and in the opportunity structures that we give, where some groups have more perception of opportunities taking them towards the future. It's just such a fascinating conversation. We could go on forever, but we've reached the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our speakers. And also in thanking our organizer, Christine, who has done all the work for this. Thank you, Christine.
Thanks.
So thanks, Ed. I'll sign off now, but really appreciate it, everyone. Is there anything that I'm missing, you guys, before I sign off? No. Just please keep your eyes in the chat, our speakers, because there's some good vibes coming your way. And I'll just let the chat run for a minute or two, but we're officially done now. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for having us, Christine and Charlie and Winnifred, and thanks, Ed. With your permission, I'd love to keep talking about how we could use the recording because my students, I'd love to introduce them to you and your work.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to make that connection too, Ed. Like that's great stuff that you're doing, and really support your agenda and really interested in everything. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a great chat. So many interesting things to keep thinking about and so much work to be done as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I noticed an email in the chat. I don't know, Ed and Sarah, if you also want to take note of that point of connection.
Yeah, great.
So we might have to bring this to an end formally, just so everyone can rush off to our next meetings. And thanks again. And we're very glad to host these events. This does bring us to the end of the PEPSS season this year, but I know next year will be equally awesome, although they can never again reach the heights of excellence of today's speakers, Ed and Sarah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Later.